Earth, so beautiful and filled with many wonders of nature, but from time to time again we see disasters take place, rip through countries, communities, households, and cause havoc. What are natural disasters? What causes them? How bad do they tend to be? But most importantly, how does humanity recover from them? These are questions I have been trying to answer throughout my senior seminar project, especially the subject of what happens after natural disaster, relief, recovery, and rebuilding. My focus of my project is to discover and dive into the process of what happens after a natural disaster. My interest in natural disaster relief comes from last summer when I went on a surf trip to Puerto Rico to help the continued rebuilding after Hurricane Maria hit in 2017 and decimated the U.S. territory. I was able to help rebuild the structures that were destroyed in the hurricane using concrete and rebar to help rebuild these structures. Another aspect I greatly appreciated when I was in Puerto Rico was speaking with the locals and seeing how grateful they were that we were helping them. That is one of the big reasons why I wanted to dive in to natural disasters. But before we get into what natural disaster relief is, what are natural disasters? The definition of a natural disaster is a natural event such as a flood, earthquake, drought, or hurricane that causes great damage or loss of life. Natural disasters have always been present in our world, whether it is the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD or the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 or the most recent earthquake in Haiti in the summer of 2021. Almost everyone has been affected by natural disasters. Another way to look at a disaster is to say what exactly starts or creates it. Besides tectonic plates moving during an earthquake, or being in a tropical climate for an hurricane to happen, it is hard to answer that question. But one could have noticed the increased quantity and magnitude of natural disasters. The number of natural disasters has increased by 10 times since 1960, according to the 2020 Ecological Threat Register. Why is this true? The best answer to that question is climate change. Rising temperatures due to pollution and CO2 emissions have made disasters more common, especially weather related disasters like hurricanes and floods, and also droughts. Unfortunately, this increase in natural disasters has drastically affected countries that are underdeveloped and that suffer from poverty. The majority of the 3.3 million disaster related deaths over the last 40 years have taken place in the underdeveloped and poorer countries. Underdeveloped countries like the South Asian countries of Indonesia and the Philippines, the sub Saharan African countries that most often suffer from drought, and the Caribbean and South American countries like Haiti, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic are just a few examples of developing countries that struggle from natural disasters and often suffer the most. Why do countries like these often suffer the most from natural disasters? Unfortunately, a lot of these countries are already suffering from poverty and unstable political climate, violence, and insufficient housing. A natural disaster of intense magnitude can and has worsened the ongoing problems in these types of countries. Developing countries can amass resources, which are incredibly important in natural disaster relief and overall recovery. One example of an unstable developing country hit by a natural disaster is Haiti in 2010, which was struggling with poverty and an unstable government before the terrible earthquake took place. Here is a clip from an interview I did with Dr. John Powers where he explains his experience with relief while helping the poor in the Dominican Republic after Hurricane George came through in 1998.
King George.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. So, I did go down with our pastor right after Hurricane George, about 2 weeks after, with a good chunk of money from donations from people here. And we worked with the local church there who were literally keeping people alive in those villages by bringing food and bringing clean water. So every day, all they did was drive to these different bates that most, were literally just destroyed. It looked like a bomb had gone off. Like it was just rubble everywhere. And folks were just living, they kind of like would lean a couple pieces of wood up to each other, just have a little shelter, but they had no food. They had no clean water. No one was from the government was coming out to help. And so NGOs and churches like the one we were affiliated with were keeping folks alive. And they did this from the end of September when the hurricane hit. I think I was at the early part of October through the end of the year, just to keep people alive.
Now, moving on to how I would attack natural disaster relief in the wake of a natural disaster.
Alert, alert, a Category 5 hurricane is developing in the Caribbean and is on track to hit the coast of Honduras, August 2025. Hurricane Milton.
Having an emergency response plan is very important. Having plans that respond and act upon a natural disaster like a hurricane or earthquake, or a disaster emergency like a gas contamination or a violent event. There are 4 important parts to disaster relief. The first is prevention and mitigation, which is reducing the risk. The second is preparedness, because being prepared and ready for disaster is very crucial. The third is a response, and the fourth is recovery.
Hurricane is being watched 24/7. Readiness and disaster planning conversations are starting.
All partners, local/state government, federal government, nonprofits have to have readiness conversations together. So when a disaster hits, there's already a plan for which parts of the government and the organizations are going to come in and provide food, transportation, medical services, etc. This is called the ESF, or Emergency Support Functions. The International Federation of the Red Cross is a stable member of.
Alert, alert, a Category 5 hurricane hit the northern coast of Honduras with 175 miles per hour winds. Initial damage injuries not known yet.
After the disaster takes place and runs through the territory, the initial damage is assessed, which drives the size and need of the response.
14,000 people have died, a great amount of injuries, infrastructure damage especially near the coast, worst hurricane to hit Honduras and nearby countries since Hurricane Mitch in 1998.
Right after the damage is assessed, the ESF groups will meet together to determine the needs of Honduras and which countries and nonprofits will provide those needs. Search and rescue is being performed on a local level not long after the hurricane. Nonprofit organizations in other countries' National Guards are on standby waiting for damage assessment and needs for the government. Next, the stabilization phase begins. For example, the U.S. National Guard will come in and run the airport. Red Cross Mexico comes in and runs a med clinic in an affected area. Red Cross Argentina to come in and set up a food, water, and station. As an example, after the earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010, the U.S. National Guard ran Haiti's capital airport to make sure the aid was coming into the country in an organized way. All hands on deck are needed for these types of disasters, and whatever a group can provide, it is very necessary. While the stabilization phase is going on, it is always a continuous planning and operation mode, constantly monitoring needs. Long-term solutions can take place. For example, the Red Cross or UNCHUF can create longer aid camps that can provide shelter, water for a long period of time. They can have drawbacks because it can create a dependency culture and disrupt local economy and daily life. Each disaster has its own plan. Partners, funding, resources drive recovery length and structure. Recovery roadblocks can make the relief process more difficult. For instance, Hurricane Maria in 2017 caused a lack of access to electricity and water, which made the relief process more difficult. After the initial relief stabilization process is carried out, then the rebuilding process and economic rebuilding process begins. The fictional hurricane in Honduras caused significant damage to structures in the north coastal part of the country, outlined in red. Structures within 3 miles of the coast were heavily damaged or destroyed. The rebuilding process will take time and is driven by a multitude of factors: money, resources, overall damage, help, and support. Having public input is very crucial to rebuilding, but rebuilding back better is even more important. Having structures that can handle natural disasters is very crucial for a multitude of reasons: protecting human life, preventing fatalities, and injuries are the two big reasons why it's crucial. One example is the tragically high levels of fatalities among school children in the 2008 Sichuan earthquake in China was caused by the unsafe buildings that did not follow the certain up to standard codes. Places that deal with natural disasters, especially in the more developed countries, have building codes that must be met. For example, Florida has a system where houses are put in different zones that have to be built in a certain way that meets requirements that can withstand hurricanes. For example, having hurricane-proof shutters. In an interview with Gary Pelletier, who's the manager for the Red Cross North Florida Division, he explains one example why building up to code is important.
In the chat?
No, I got it. Do
Okay,
you see
yeah,
my
now,
screen?
now we got it.
Okay, I don't know if you remember this, but so Hurricane Michael hit the Panhandle as a Cat 5 hurricane. That's Mexico Beach, or was Mexico Beach, okay? And what really drew people to this house was it was like the only one standing. Well, it was the only one standing because it recently went through a rebuild and it built towards the standard. It had the right mitigation, as we call it.
Yep.
That's a big term in emergency management. Mitigation. That's what
Yep.
we. And so, to Mrs. French's point, is if a country has a strong mitigation standards and programs, their infrastructure is built to fit a certain, like a hurricane, I think is mostly used because the wind forces are.
Mortality from the earthquake of 2010 in Haiti was the highest among the urban poor of the capital of Haiti, Port-au-Prince, who lived in poorly constructed and crowded housing. There are two great differences between a disaster that may hit a country like the US or a disaster that may hit a country like Haiti or the DR or Honduras. Countries like the US are not facing mass poverty and an unstable economy like the developing nations of Haiti, the DR, Honduras. When a disaster hits these countries, they find themselves in a deeper hole, and it makes it even harder for them to rebuild their economy. An example that stands out to me is when a charitable organization called Mercy Corps helped in the economic rebuild of Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, giving around 28,000 people temporary jobs to go around and clean up. Another interesting thing this organization did is start a cash transfer program, which allowed Haitians to buy necessities, and in doing so, helping jumpstart the local economy. 5 years later, has this plan worked? Has the infrastructure started to be built yet? And if it has been built, can it sustain another hurricane? Well, this is a great question to ask years after the hurricane takes place. But the sad thing is that most developing countries that suffer from natural disasters are still struggling, and will for a while. Most of these countries that are already suffering from poverty are dug into an even deeper hole after a natural disaster. What does this say about the rest of the world? Are we helping enough? Though we may be sending aid and resources, is it getting to these people, and is it helping them? One of the biggest questions we can ask is how we can stop natural disasters. The one answer I have for that is climate change. The US, Germany, the UK, and many of the world's biggest countries have sent carbon emissions into the atmosphere unchecked for more than a century. Some of the poorest places of the world now have to deal with the consequences of climate change they had nothing to do with at all. Is this fair? Absolutely not. But we can try to make it fair by realizing what is happening today and how we could better the earth by doing and not saying. Not saying that we can limit CO2 emissions, but actually doing it by using renewable resources like solar, wind, hydropower, and using less fossil fuels. I hope this video has brought you a better understanding of what happens to developing countries when a natural disaster takes place, how they recover from them, and how it overall affects how society lives. Thank you.